Hey, folks, this is Congressman Scott Perry from Pennsylvania's 10th District, and with the normal weekly legislative recap. Now, this is going to be a little different. I'm going to recap it, but I've got a great guest host or a great one of my colleagues here, the great Matt Gaetz, probably the second most persecuted man in Washington, D.C. I think that might be right. And let's start out with what happened at the beginning of the week. It was the largest fiscal surrender that unfortunately we've had to endure. Oh, and I don't know about 4 months or something like that, right, Matt? The minibus, which is a combination of bills. It's only in Washington that we talk in terms of minibus or omnibus.
Usually the short bus is actually not the one you want to be branding and taking credit for. But in this case, we saw the Republican majority embrace the minibus energy.
That's exactly right. So normally what happens when Congress can't figure out the funding, right? We take your tax money and then we spend it. And that's all supposed to be done by the end of September. That's the end of the fiscal year. But when we can't get it done, we do a series of things called continuing resolutions or CRs until we end up with an omnibus right before Christmas, where they jam everybody into a corner and say, you either vote for this. It's all figured out by just a couple people. All the federal spending for the whole year figured out by a couple people. You either vote for this or we're going to accuse you of shutting down the government. What we did this year is we punted over Christmas and split it in two. And so the first part of that two split happened just this week. And they're touting this as this great victory because we didn't have a mini or an omnibus right before Christmas. What were your thoughts on, generally speaking, the levels and what was in that bill?
Well, if we continue to spend at this level with the revenue we currently have, we're going to lose the country as we know it. People's access to capital will be substantially constrained. The central thesis of the American dream, home ownership, will be entirely out of reach for a lot of millennials and a lot of Gen Z. And I think people will start to feel the impact of this debt more than they have in the past. The reason we've accumulated a $34 trillion debt is people don't associate any specific pain to that, right? And now they kind of are, because we're at that point, and this legislation only makes those problems more grave and more challenging. And there was a lack of courage in our Republican colleagues to take the tough votes to reduce spending. Like, the honest answer is that all the easy decisions are behind us. Yeah. It's only tough ones ahead. And you and I fought for spending cuts to like foreign aid, wasteful programs that are like have only a dubious connection to the constitutional authority of the federal government. And we saw dozens of Republicans time and again, when we tried to work those single subject spending bills, bail on us, sign up with their lobbyist backers and their special interest donors. And this is the result of that. This is the result of not having a majority of Republicans sufficiently capable and willing to fight to put downward pressure on spending and divided government. And it's just us. You're never going to get the Senate Democrats or the Senate Republicans or the White House to want to put downward pressure on spending. So I'm deeply disappointed in it. And, I've got to ask you, though, one of the little melodramas that has emerged out of this is the LGBTQ club in Pennsylvania, right? Because now Senator Fetterman has reversed his position yet again. First, both of your senators, Senator Casey and Senator Fetterman, said they wanted funding for this place that did all of this publicly funded recreational adult activity. And then they sent a letter withdrawing it. Senator Fetterman has now subsequently come out and said he was not involved in the decision to withdraw his support for that. That was made at the staff level.
Yeah, that's a serious admission of just failure to be competent. If you're not going to be involved in the decisions and the communications that your office sends out, what does that tell your constituents? I mean, and like you said, Matt, think about this. This is one of 6,000 on just this half. This is the minibus. This is half of the year's spending. The next half is coming shortly, but over 6,000 earmarks, and one of them goes to this club in Philadelphia where, as Matt characterizes it, adult recreational activity. Tell me where the federal government's involvement in your tax money. You're forced to send your taxes to the federal government. How is this ever in any way a federal issue? This isn't a highway that runs from Florida to Pennsylvania, from Matt Gaetz's hometown to Scott Perry's hometown. This is one building in a city in one state, yet Matt Gaetz's constituents, his bosses, his taxpayers are forced to pay it. And that's only one of 6,000 of these what we call earmarks.
But that's the glue. That, like, explain to people how that becomes this corrupt currency in Washington.
So one of the ways it becomes the corrupt currency is, for instance, most people, whether they're Democrat or Republican, will go home and tell their constituents, government's too big. We got to cut the scope. The size of it is spending too much money. It's bankrupting itself. And we got to do that. And so they won't want to vote for this bill that spends all this money. But here, maybe we can see if you'll vote for it if we give you this, $1 million for this, $1 million for that, 20 million for this. And the next thing you know, you're talking, this current set of earmarks is $12 billion on top of the spending, which is $30 billion on top of the last spending that Nancy Pelosi passed that every single House Republican voted against. And they're now just voting for it. That's the corrosive influence.
Johnson told us that the reason we were splitting these things up is that it would allow us to isolate some of the most problematic entities. And if the Democrats and the White House weren't willing to play ball, we could have these microburst shutdowns around those. But then we front-loaded a lot of the bureaucracy in this vote we took this week, and we backloaded the stuff we care about, which is paying the troops and paying the Border Patrol. So it's sort of like we paid the ransom without even getting the hostage.
We never got the hostage, right? So Matt and I both voted against it. We're trying to not bankrupt the country because every time we do this, you see it in the prices that you pay at the grocery store, at the gas station, your electricity bills, you name it. Every single thing you pay for costs more money. So that was the spending bill. Let's move on to the Laken-Riley Act. Laken-Riley, young lady in Georgia.
Yeah.
In Georgia, goes out for a run and is murdered, brutally murdered, I can't even describe it, was murdered by some illegal foreign national, someone who came across the border illegally, was arrested, not deported, and then moved to Georgia and killed this young woman. And so we passed a bill to try and combat, since the administration won't do anything at all except aid and abet the invasion of our country, we passed a bill to try and shock their conscience into doing something that recognizes this tragedy is happening too often in the United States of America. Even once is too often, but this is completely preventable. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, we should not be paroling these people into the country. And in this particular case, a competent Department of Homeland Security operating under the types of laws and kind of legal guidance we had during the Trump administration, they never would have been let out. And like, I remember when we were growing up, you know, like our parents just had to be worried about the weirdo down the street, or, you know, things you knew about that were kind of domestic to the neighborhoods and towns we lived in. Now, everywhere in the country, you got to be worried that, you know, the last time we allowed the third world's prisons to be emptied across the border, someone ended up in your community totally unvetted, totally not a part of kind of the normal warning system in a community about someone breaking bad or could do harm. And then you get these tragic results that sear the conscience of the country. But, you know, what did Joe Biden, I think you've got a clip of it. Joe Biden referred to her as the head coach of the University of Southern California.
Yeah, so this transitions right to the State of the Union address, and many of us wore something with Laken-Riley on it because we wanted President Biden, when he gave the State of the Union, to acknowledge her death, the tragedy that he literally caused. Can we play that clip now?
Laken-Riley, an innocent young woman who was killed by an illegal. That's right. But how many of the thousands of people being killed by illegals? To her parents, I say, my heart goes out to you, having lost children myself. I understand. But look, if we change the dynamic at the border, people pay these smugglers $8,000 to get across the border because they know if they get by and let into the country, it's 6 to 8 years before they have a hearing. And it's worth taking the chance of the $8,000. But if it's only 6 weeks, the idea is it's highly unlikely that people will pay that money and come all that way, knowing that they'll be able to be kicked out quickly. I would respectfully suggest my Republican friends owe it to the American people, get this bill done. We need to act now. And if my predecessor is watching, instead of paying...
So we already saw the reaction of Matt Gaetz. We just saw it on the film there, but you're going to have to expand on this. So let's unpack the State of the Union, starting with that. First of all, hats off to Marjorie Taylor Greene. He wasn't going to mention her name.
Hats on, as the case may be.
Hats on to me. Yeah. He wasn't going to mention Laken Riley's name, but there was just a moment of a pause where she shouted it out and forced him to acknowledge it. Of course, he couldn't get it right. He mispronounced the young lady's name, and then went on to blame the House of Representatives for not passing a bill, knowing that we passed a bill over a year ago now that they refused to take up. How tragic is this, and how out of touch with reality is this?
It's such a sad and, at this point, unidirectional issue. The flow is only rising. It's not ebbing and flowing, and that's deeply concerning. That clip was wild. First of all, Joe Biden calling the illegal alien an illegal.
Right.
Oh, I mean, you should have seen.
He was off script, right? So he said what he really believes and what everybody knows when he was off script.
They had to wake the squad up with smelling salts after he said that, okay? So love that. Second, the like insensitive, offhanded reference to, thousands of people get killed by illegals. And I'm like, yeah, dude, that's your policies. That's because you is he diminishing the savage murder of one person because it just fits within a data set to him? That was a really bizarre take. And then thereafter, to suggest that the Langford bill was somehow a solution to this wave of illegal aliens in our country is blatantly false. It was an invitation for those people to come into the country illegally. And what's just so frustrating is James Langford, who was not a particularly remarkable senator before this. It wasn't like people knew James Langford as a consequence of any seminal moment or bill. He goes out and gives cover to this guy, to these broken border policies, for Biden to sit there and lecture us like some angry grandpa.
And it is cover. And then finally, because, we've seen it's just good old Joe. I guess this was angry Joe or what have you. But he always seems to turn it around that it's about Joe. So his son's death is tragic, but it was due to something different than what could have been avoided here, which this is completely avoidable. Laken Riley's death was completely avoidable because these people that are coming to our country illegally don't belong here, have no business being here, and should not be allowed to be here. But he turned it around and saying, I've suffered your pain. I've lost a child too. It's not about Joe Biden. It's about our country that is being invaded at his behest. And then to say that, well, these people are paying $8,000 to come here, and if they just know that they're going to be turned away in 6 months as opposed to 6 years, they won't come. How about this? The rest of America is going, why don't you just do what the last guy, Donald Trump, did 3 years ago and turn them around now before they ever get here? Won't cost us anything, including our daughter's life. Why isn't that the solution?
Well, because this is an invasion by design, and they're in on it. And everyone wants to call me crazy and a replacement theorist when I say this, but we see a mass exodus out of the urban centers in this country right now because a lot of the voters who have been voting Democrat for those leaders have seen their lives diminished. They've seen their prospects diminished. They see the streets are less safe, and so they're leaving. And then those folks need a new batch of voters to dupe. And so they're establishing these sanctuary cities, and you get these waves of migrants into those places. And it's making like our nation's capital, Chicago, New York, some of the most iconic places in the world. It feels like a third world country. I saw a guy the other day peeing on the Smithsonian sign here in town, just shameless, like in the middle of the day, just urinating on this. And I'm thinking, no wonder Trump's so like eager to recapitalize this place. It's just not worthy of a world superpower to have our great cities in such disrepair as a consequence of these choices.
And the folks that are leaving the cities where they elected the people that allow this, of course, they take their politics with them. They don't change, right? They don't connect the fact that where they live is unsafe and unaffordable, so they want to get out. but then they want to get out and elect the same
You don't feel
people.
that changing? I'll push back on that. I'm starting to see more and more of these working class, people who have lived in cities start to realize, hey, like my kid's stuck in a bad school. I can't count on the fact that I can walk back and forth to the store without some sort of violent event happening. And like that's our growth market. Everybody wants to talk about some of these white woke millennials that are coming from Republican families and turning a little left. But I do believe that there is a working class surge from people who actually do value productivity, and they see the Democratic Party draining it.
I sure hope you're right, Matt, but I would also tell you this: California, for the first time in history, is losing population. Most of it coming or going, it looks like, to Texas, Arizona, to the desert, right? A lot of desert places, and those places are turning more blue, not more red. So,
out of California, undeniably. In Florida, we get the New Yorkers and we tell them, y'all come, but just leave your Democrat voter registration card north of the Mason-Dixon line.
That's how it should be. We certainly hope it is. And as long as we're talking about invasions and things like that, the president started out, first of all, he was late, right? Because of the Hamas terrorists in his party protesting him. Nobody wants to talk about that. They're anti-Semitic Hamas protesters in his party that are out protesting. So he's late. But when he gets there, he spends about 15 minutes talking about a country 5,000 miles away. And then he spends a certain amount of time talking about what has normally been a rock rib constituency for left-wing Democrats. Let's play the clip on Gaza, and let's talk about that a little bit.
Tonight, I'm directing the U.S. military to lead an emergency mission to establish a temporary pier in the Mediterranean on the coast of Gaza that can receive large shipments carrying food, water, medicine, and temporary shelters. No U.S. boots will be on the ground. A temporary pier will enable a massive increase in the amount of humanitarian assistance getting into Gaza every day.
Okay, so a lot to unpack here, Matt. I've started out with thinking American boots aren't going to be in the ground. Well, those boots have soldiers in them, but are they going to be on the pier?
Right. Yeah. If there's no boots on the ground, how are you building a port in Gaza?
Right.
Like, I mean, you're the general, you're the military man. If we're building a port in Gaza, there's going to have to be some force that is protecting the people engaged in that work. So then there'll be force protection for those folks. Then there'll be an extraction team in the event of that. We are going to be excessively entangled in the worst neighborhood in the world.
That's exactly right. And you think about, if this commander-in-chief is in charge of this, like he was the withdrawal in Afghanistan while the Taliban was protecting our forces on the withdrawal, does that mean Hamas is going to be protecting our forces, putting the port together and securing the goods, the American taxpayer goods pouring into Gaza? And then further, I had to think, why is this America's sole mission and responsibility? Iran created Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, all these jihadists, the Houthis. Iran's responsible for that. Why isn't Iran providing the humanitarian support for the war for their allies of Hamas?
Well, and to be clear, I feel for the people starving and dying in Gaza. I mean, the when you hear the fact that they don't have fresh water and they're drinking salt water and they're having renal failure as a consequence, that is a terrible way to die.
Yeah.
That is terrible. I don't believe that the United States being the mail truck on aid is going to make this better. I believe that the rich Gulf monarchies that have the connections and the capabilities and the resources can and should step up to provide this. And Israel should not be attacking any aid trucks. And if they're hiding weapons in those aid trucks, that's a whole different story. And if they're hiding terrorists, but we ought to work out our role here should not be like making Gaza great again with the construction of some port, which, by the way, I don't know who's going to own that port in 5 to 10 years. It'll either be Hamas or the Chinese, but it certainly won't be us. How about we worry about getting the Chinese out of our own ports before we're building a port in the Middle East? That again, I am not against the mission of trying to save these children, particularly the innocent people that are there, but we are not the least cost avoider to that famine and that destruction. The Middle Eastern countries are.
Well, and you're right about it. I mean, when you find out that the leaders of Hamas are living in they're living in Qatar, as I understand it, right? Why can't they call up their friends in Qatar from their penthouse and say, could you send some water, some food to these children and these innocent victims?
Well, I think that could happen. And by the way, I think Qatar and the UAE and Saudi and Bahrain, I think they've been involved in aid to date. But I think that when we get in there and try to Bigfoot it, it never really works out well for us. Like the sad deal in the Middle East is we always end up funding every side of the conflict.
Well, that was my other point. We're funding both sides of this war, and we have been for some time. And for a country that's $34 trillion in debt, soon to be $35 trillion in debt by May, we're not saying that the lives aren't worth it, but we're saying we have to proceed with caution and judiciously here with American tax dollars. And while we can be involved in it, I think I would agree with Matt that these other countries that are in the neighborhood have much more at stake and should be and have the resources. Their bottom line isn't the same as ours, even close, right? We're 35 trillion in debt. I don't think any of these countries.
These are some of the richest, right? Yeah, these are some of the richest countries in the world per capita. And I think that they're also like not terrible diplomats. I think they would be able to get it done more than an excessive presence from the West.
And I must just say this as well. As much as many of the people in Gaza hate the Jews in Israel right on their doorstep, you know who they hate worse or more is us. So that makes a lot of sense. They're going to send in a bunch of food. And I'm all about changing hearts and minds. I'm sure that when you're starving and you're dying of thirst, you'll take whatever you can get. But I think it would just be better. We would be better served if the other countries in the region took a lead role on this and
But also, this is politics, Scott, right? Because I mean, Biden's real problem here is not that he's lost any appeal to the people in the middle. It's the traditional Democrat base that has left him. Like young people are not for this war, for the U.S. involvement in this war. And so he's trying to do something to get back a lot of the voters in Dearborn, Michigan and elsewhere who have just gone totally anti-Biden. And so it's as much of a virtue signal as it is a strategy.
You're right about that, but the American taxpayers on the hook for it. And it does I think, signal a historic shift from really supporting Israel to now supporting what are known to most people as the terrorists of Hamas. But as long as we're talking about young people and maybe some economics, let's play our final clip from the speech about what another proposal that the president is offering.
I know the cost of housing is so important to you. If inflation keeps coming down, mortgage rates will come down as well, and the Fed acknowledges that. But I'm not waiting. I want to provide an annual tax credit that will give Americans $400 a month for the next 2 years as mortgage rates come down, to put toward their mortgages when they buy their first home or trade up for a little more space. Just for 2 years.
So this is astounding to me, how out of touch. Literally saying that mortgage rates are coming down and that inflation is coming down. Now, I know I'm not expecting President Biden to be, well, he has bought a few homes, maybe not recently, but I don't expect him to be going to the grocery store. But any of my bosses and your bosses that are putting food on their table and paying their mortgage, or heaven forbid, they've had to buy a new house in the last 3 years, those prices have skyrocketed. And so to me, this is one of the prime examples of the president of the United States and the State of the Union being completely out of touch with the reality for most of America. And $400 a month. When he first said that, I said, did he say $400 a year? $400 a month. So if you're selling a house, first of all, let's think about it. He's going to take your taxes and then give you $400 of your taxes back so that he can claim he's helping you. But everybody that's selling a house is going to say, well, Matt, you've got $400 in your pocket more every month. So the price of housing is just going to go up.
There was so much about that I didn't understand. He said first-time home buyers or people who need a little more space. So that's a lot of people. And like, does that mean seniors that downsize in Florida don't get the same access? Does that mean seniors who are downsizing, empty nesters, are now going to be subsidizing people who want to buy larger houses? And then for Joe Biden to say that the way he wants to deal with inflation and rising interest rates is to pour a bunch of government money into a new program, That's sort of like me saying I want to work on my diet strategy by having the all-you-can-eat buffet at Kentucky Fried Chicken. It is quite literally the problem. The reason why we have high interest rates and high inflation is because we have so much government spending and so much government debt. And then with no pay for, he goes and offers a new government program that is by definition inflationary. Every purported solution he had to inflation was explicitly inflationary. When he's talking about raising the minimum wage, same thing. And you know what he never talked about once? High prices. When we talk to our constituents, I don't know that it's always expressed in terms of inflation. It's like the cost of living. This stuff costs too much.
Right.
Checking out at the grocery store used to cost me $1, and now it's 40% up or more.
Right.
And he didn't speak in any way in those terms. And I think that clip you played just demonstrate it was the perfect encapsulation of everything that was wrong with the president's presentation.
Yeah, he just can't seem to acknowledge that he's actually caused this by flooding our economy with all these unaccounted for dollars, making every single dollar worth less. But what he did do is blame. I live in what is often known as the snack food capital of the world. We make a lot of potato chips, a lot of pretzels. And he complained that the people that package those, great people that work hard, make a great product, with their packaging, they're reducing the size of the packaging. And what people don't realize is those producers are actually doing Joe Biden a favor, because the only alternative they have is to raise prices. And people notice that immediately. Prices have already been raised, right? So the only other option they've had is to put a little less in or make the bag a little smaller. It is the cost of government spending. And instead of acknowledging it and trying actually to have a solution, he blames them like he blames everybody else. That's the major theme of the speech for me. I don't know how you felt about it, Matt, but I thought as it went on, first of all, he was late. Second, okay, well, we can forgive a little bit of that, but then talks about a country 5,000 miles away, not the state of America, the state of Ukraine, and then goes on to blame Americans for all the problems that he's created, and thinks that we're going to get it if he just yells at us a little more.
Yeah, there definitely was an angry energy. Like that, I guess I would encapsulate it this way. Grandpa knows it's time to take the keys and the nuclear codes away, and he's not very happy about it.
Well, I guess that is a way to characterize it, but we've seen, it's just old Joe, it's just old kind of handsy Joe, or whatever. There's a lot of ways to characterize old Joe, but this is angry Joe.
Yes.
Like he knew that he had to come out with vigor, because the claim is that he's too old.
Did he meet that test?
He came out and yelled at us for an hour and a half or something. And like, that's the answer to, I can stand up here and lead the country, right? And
a lot of people who have family members with dementia, they see that anger side. We talk a lot about the lack of cognitive, but there is a side sometimes to that decline that has outbursts of anger. And I think they just tried to ride that wave home.
Well, that might be the case. And from my viewpoint, I don't know how people at home saw it, but from my viewpoint, it was just him yelling at us. And when he couldn't convince us of him being right, just yell more, yell louder. We're going to get it. Tell us one more time that the world is watching. I was not convinced by any of that. I tried to listen. And the other thing that was astounding to me, Matt, you've been to a bunch of these State of the Union addresses. It doesn't matter if it's Obama or President Trump. There's always a line in there that you agree on. Right? Even if you don't agree with the policy of the person delivering the message, I'll give you an example. Each president will say, America has always been a shining city on the hill where we hoped the people of America could do better, and it's the promise of opportunity for every individual. And you don't disagree with that. So you're like, I can stand for that. We're looking for an opportunity to be with the guy on the other side that we disagree with. There was almost no opportunities.
Well, for me, that opportunity was when he said he was going to commute a bunch of marijuana sentences. I got on my feet for that one. You just need to modernize your sensibilities there, Representative Perry.
Well, Matt and I we have different views on that. I led the charge on medicinal.
Who do you think is buying all those snack foods that are the economic development in your district that you were just talking about?
Well, we want to continue to buy snack foods, but look, this isn't the topic of conversation, but if you want it to be, look, if you want to do whatever you want to do with your body, God bless you. The government shouldn't be involved.
We love your libertarian energy.
But when I got to pay for it, Like when you're driving under the influence and you run off the road and kill my family, now I've got something I've got to say about it. So it's a little bit of give and take. I would like the government to be out of it altogether, but unfortunately, I have to help pay for it. And now, since you brought it up, I also have to pay for your snack foods when you got the munchies.
That is going right back to Pennsylvania. That is going right back to Pennsylvania. That's like me complaining about sugar.
Well, I'm, as you know, Matt, and I think you truly are this way, as much as we're for our own districts, we're also for the whole country. We're for the whole country.
It's true. The parochialism around here, it goes back to where we started the conversation, how people are willing to lean into the parochialism at the expense of the nation. And that's what you and I got to fight against.
Well, listen, it has been awesome. It has been awesome giving you the recap for the week. What's been really awesome is being on Rumble today and on my first Rumble foray with the great, the world-renowned, the second most oppressed person in Washington, D.C., the gentleman from the great state of Florida, Matt Gaetz. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.